47 American paratroopers walked into the jungle. 72 hours later, only 19 walked back out. No firefight was recorded. No emergency radio calls were logged. No bodies were ever recovered. The missing men were not listed as killed in action. They were classified as something worse: missing. What unsettled American commanders wasn't just the loss, it was the pattern. These men hadn't been wiped out in a single ambush. They hadn't triggered booby traps. They hadn't even fired their weapons. They had been removed from the jungle. Quietly, individually, without witnesses. And when military intelligence finally pieced together what had happened, the Pentagon made a decision so unusual it would remain classified for decades. They did not send reinforcements. They did not authorize another sweep. They did not escalate. Instead, they took a red marker and drew a line across the map of South Vietnam. Next to that line, 3 words appeared: off limits, Australians only. This decision made no sense on paper. The United States had more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam, entire Marine divisions supported by artillery, air power, and B-52 bombers. The Australians? They barely had 500 men in the region, and yet American Marines were now forbidden to step into an area where Australian soldiers were not only allowed, but expected to operate. The reason for that decision lay 23 kilometers southeast of the Australian base at Nui Dat, where the long high mountains rose abruptly from the coastal plains like the exposed spine of some ancient creature. From the air, the range looked insignificant. 14 square kilometers of jungle-covered limestone stretching toward the South China Sea. American reconnaissance aircraft had photographed every square meter. Between 1966 and 1968, B-52 bombers dropped more than 40,000 tons of ordnance on its slopes. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines had conducted 3 major operations into its northern approaches, and yet the Viet Cong's D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion continued operating from the mountains as if untouched. The problem was not American firepower. The problem was that the long high mountains were not terrain in the conventional sense. They were a living system. Beneath the vegetation lay underground rivers, limestone caverns, and tunnel networks expanded and fortified over 2 decades. The Viet Cong had not simply hidden inside the mountains. They had become part of them. American doctrine could not process this reality. To American planners, terrain was something you seized, cleared, and controlled. But the long high mountains were not a position, they were an organism. And in March of 1967, that organism consumed an American unit. A company from the 173rd Airborne Brigade was ordered to conduct a sweep and clear operation through the eastern approaches. What happened over the next 72 hours was classified at the highest levels of MACV command. 47 paratroopers entered the jungle. 19 walked back out. Their rest were not recovered. Their bodies were never found. Their equipment never surfaced. Their final moments were never reconstructed. The official after-action report blamed enemy action and complex terrain. The unofficial assessment, circulated only among senior intelligence officers, told a very different story. The Viet Cong had not fought the Americans, they had hunted them. Men were pulled from patrol lines without a shot being fired. Individuals disappeared during routine movement. Entire elements realized someone was missing only after they failed to respond to roll call. This was the moment MACV Command made a decision that would remain buried for over 40 years. The Long High Mountains were declared off-limits to American ground forces. But the problem remained. D445 Battalion continued launching attacks. The jungle still belonged to the enemy. Someone had to go in. And that is when the Australians were called.
To understand why the Pentagon handed a forbidden zone to a foreign force, you must first understand that the Australians were not fighting the same war as the Americans. The 1st Australian Task Force arrived in Phuoc Thu Province in 1966 with a mandate that differed fundamentally from U.S. doctrine. While American units measured success in body counts and territory seized, the Australians were given a single objective: pacify the province. How they achieved that was left entirely to them. Within the Australian Task Force existed a unit so small it barely registered on American organizational charts: the Special Air Service Regiment. 3 squadrons rotating through Vietnam, never more than 150 men in country at any given time. Officially, they were classified as reconnaissance. In reality, they were something else, something older, something far closer to hunting than warfare. Captain William "Billy" Dundas assumed command of SAS 2nd Squadron in February of 1968. Before Vietnam, he had been a sheep station manager in rural Queensland. His only prior combat experience came during the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo. It was there, in jungles so dense visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters, that Dundas learned lessons no Western military manual taught. But Dundas was not the most dangerous man in his unit. That distinction belonged to soldiers whose very existence the Australian government would deny for decades: the Aboriginal trackers. Private Dorian Walker was a Pintupi man from Australia's western desert. He was recruited through a program that officially did not exist. His people had survived for over 40,000 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth by developing sensory skills modern science still struggles to quantify. Walker could track a man through jungle so dense American infrared sensors saw nothing but green blur. He could determine the age of a footprint within 6 hours by the moisture of disturbed vegetation. He could smell rice and fish paste on a Vietnamese soldier from hundreds of meters downwind. When Walker arrived at Nui Dat in April of 1968, the American liaison officer attached to the task force dismissed the tracker program outright. Captain James Morrison, MACV liaison, viewed the tracker program as colonial nostalgia. Aboriginals tracking humans in Vietnam? In the age of helicopter gunships and electronic sensors? The idea seemed absurd. Morrison revised that opinion 17 days later, under circumstances that resulted in his immediate request for transfer. But before we reach that moment, you need to understand what truly separated Australian SAS operations from everything the Americans had attempted. American counterinsurgency doctrine followed a simple principle: find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with overwhelming firepower. This approach had won World War II. It had crushed conventional armies across continents. But it failed catastrophically in Southeast Asia for one reason: you cannot destroy what you cannot see. The Viet Cong understood this. They studied American tactics long before the first Marine battalions landed. They knew Americans moved in large units, made noise, followed predictable patterns, and relied on artillery and air support. Against such an enemy, the jungle itself became the ultimate weapon. All you had to do was wait. Australian SAS doctrine inverted every assumption of American warfare. Where Americans moved in platoons, Australians moved in 5-man patrols. Where Americans cleared jungle with defoliants and napalm, Australians learned to move without disturbing a single leaf.
What Captain Morrison witnessed that day was not an isolated incident. It was a demonstration. What followed in the long, high mountains would push American military intelligence into territory it was not prepared to confront. By late 1968, Australian signals intercepts delivered an assessment American analysts initially dismissed as impossible. The Viet Cong's D445 battalion had established a regimental-scale headquarters inside the Long Hai cave system. Not just fighting positions, a field hospital, a political training center, arms caches sufficient to sustain operations for 6 months. American response options were limited. B-52 strikes had already proven ineffective against the deep limestone caves. Helicopter assault was suicide. Anti-aircraft positions covered every viable approach, and ground operations would require forces 3rd Marine Division could not spare without compromising other regions. The Australian solution was simple and terrifying. They would not attempt to destroy the complex. They would map it. Every entrance, every exit, every supply route, every movement, and they would do it from inside the enemy's security perimeter. 5-man patrols, operating alone for up to 3 weeks at a time. Where Americans announced their presence with helicopters and radio chatter, Australians walked in silently from kilometers away. They did not see themselves as soldiers. They saw themselves as hunters. And in hunting, there is no such thing as a fair fight. On June 15, 1968, Captain Morrison accompanied a 5-man SAS patrol into the northern approaches of the Long Hai Mountains. What he witnessed would eventually reach the desk of General Creighton Abrams himself. The patrol departed New Dot at 0300 hours. They covered 8 kilometers of rubber plantation before reaching the jungle fringe. Morrison immediately noticed something unsettling. There was no talking, no hand signals, no sound. Communication was conducted through touch, a shoulder squeeze to stop, an arm brush to change direction. By dawn, they had covered 12 kilometers and established a position overlooking a trail intersection believed to serve as a courier route for D445 Battalion. Then, the Australians did something Morrison had never seen before. They did not dig in. They did not establish fields of fire. 4 men melted into the jungle. The 5th, Private Walker, moved forward alone. For 20 minutes, Walker studied the trail. He sniffed the air, touched vegetation, lowered his face to the ground. When he returned, he whispered something so quietly Morrison could not hear it from 2 meters away. The patrol leader nodded, and the Australians began repositioning so slowly they seemed almost geological. 11 hours later, 3 Viet Cong couriers walked directly into the ambush. The engagement lasted 4 seconds. 3 enemy dead, 0 Australian casualties, no shots audible beyond 50 meters. But that was not what disturbed Morrison. What disturbed him came after. Instead of extracting, the Australians stayed. 6 hours later, a 7-man Viet Cong search team arrived. They found the bodies arranged upright against trees, weapons placed neatly across their laps, and tucked into each collar an ace of spades. From 50 meters away, Morrison watched hardened fighters unravel. One man vomited, another fired blindly into the jungle. The Australians did not engage, they simply watched. Morrison's report concluded with a single sentence: Australian SAS does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare using enemy bodies as communication. Personal recommendation: I do not wish to participate in future joint operations. What Captain Morrison witnessed that day was not an isolated incident. It was a demonstration. What followed in the long, high mountains would push American military intelligence into territory it was not prepared to confront. By late 1968, Australian signals intercepts delivered an assessment American analysts initially dismissed as impossible. The Viet Cong's D445 battalion had established a regimental-scale headquarters inside the Long Hai cave system. Not just fighting positions, a field hospital, a political training center, arms caches sufficient to sustain operations for 6 months. American response options were limited. B-52 strikes had already proven ineffective against the deep limestone caves. Helicopter assault was suicide. Anti-aircraft positions covered every viable approach. And ground operations would require forces 3rd Marine Division could not spare without compromising other regions. The Australian solution was simple and terrifying. They would not attempt to destroy the complex. They would map it. Every entrance, every exit, every supply route, every movement. And they would do it from inside the enemy's security perimeter. 5-man patrols, operating alone for up to 3 weeks at a time. Over the next 4 months, Australian SAS conducted 17 long-range reconnaissance patrols into the Long Hai Mountains. They lived where the Viet Cong lived, moved where the Viet Cong moved, and learned things bombing never could. But something else happened. Something no intelligence estimate predicted. The Viet Cong began seeing ghosts. It started subtly. Sentries reported sounds with no source: a snapped twig, a faint rustle, a presence just beyond visibility. Patrols investigated, found nothing. Then men began disappearing, not in combat, not during ambushes, during routine movements. The D445 battalion's operational log, captured after the war, recorded the descent. November 3, 1968. 3 comrades failed to return from water collection. No bodies found, no blood, no evidence of contact. Political officer suspects desertion. Commander disagrees. 4 days later, November 7th, Sentry Position 4 reported movement at 0000 hours. Flare illumination revealed nothing. Sentry found at dawn. Throat cut. Adjacent positions 15 meters away heard nothing. By mid-November, movement restricted to daylight hours only. Reinforcements requested. Request denied. Area considered secure from American operations. It was secure from Americans. It was not secure from Australians. What the D445 battalion could not understand was that the men hunting them had learned their craft long before military academies existed. Private Dorian Walker identified 17 habitual movement routes through the jungle, runs, like animal trails in the bush, paths carved not by intent but by repetition. The Australians did not close these routes, they weaponized them. They selected 2 or 3 high-value runs and turned them into killing grounds. They struck unpredictably, then vanished. The effect was not measured in body count, though Australian kill ratios would eventually reach 17-1. The effect was psychological collapse. By December of 1968, D445 Battalion had effectively ceased offensive operations. Their numbers were intact, their supplies sufficient, their weapons functional, but their will was broken. They refused to patrol at night. Units clustered tightly together. Political officers struggled to maintain cohesion. Men believed something lived in the jungle, something watching, something waiting. American intelligence struggled to understand why Australian methods worked where American firepower had failed. The answer was philosophy. American doctrine assumed superiority of force produced superiority of results. If something didn't work, add more of it. More troops, more bombs, more helicopters. Australian doctrine emerged from a different tradition. Small wars, colonial policing, frontier survival. They had spent a century fighting enemies who could not be overwhelmed because overwhelming force simply did not exist. They learned patience, fieldcraft, psychological manipulation. But there was something else, something American observers struggled to articulate. The Australians appeared comfortable in the jungle. Where American soldiers showed anxiety and tension, Australian SAS moved with familiarity, as if the jungle belonged to them. Captain Morrison's final report, submitted in January of 1969, captured the realization American special operations would spend decades trying to replicate. The jungle was not the enemy's weapon. It could be yours. If you were willing to become something other than a conventional soldier. By the spring of 1969, the long high mountains no longer functioned as a battlefield. They had become a psychological exclusion zone. Not because the Viet Cong were eliminated. They remained in their caves, their weapons intact, their supply lines functional. What had collapsed was something far more important: their will. Captured documents, interrogation reports, and observable behavior all told the same story. Units refused to patrol areas where Australian SAS had been reported. Orders went unexecuted. Political officers struggled to maintain discipline in formations gripped by fear. The D445 Battalion was not destroyed through attrition. It had been neutralized through terror. But this success came at a cost, one that Australian authorities would spend decades trying to minimize. The men who learned to hunt humans in the long high mountains did not return unchanged. They went home to sheep stations, factories, and suburbs, carrying something civilian life could not absorb. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, not despite fewer casualties, but because of the nature of their work. They had learned to think like predators, and predators do not easily return to the herd. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam was completed in 1974. Top secret, distributed to fewer than 50 recipients. Its conclusions contradicted core assumptions of American military doctrine. First, small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel consistently achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. Australian SAS kill ratios reached 17-1. Conventional infantry units averaged closer to 1-1. Second, Indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted to jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities no technological system could replicate. Proposals to recruit Native American trackers for similar programs were submitted. They were never implemented. Third, psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale produced strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep. Fourth, and most controversially, Australian forces operated under fewer restrictions than American units. Certain practices involving treatment of enemy dead and psychological operations would have violated standing MACV directives if conducted by U.S. personnel. This ensured the report remained classified. The Pentagon had no interest in explaining why its most effective allies succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. The political implications were dangerous. The moral implications were uncomfortable. So the story faded, not erased, just buried. In the decades after Vietnam, fragments of the Australian SAS story began to surface. Veteran memoirs, declassified documents, academic research. Each revelation chipped away at the official narrative. The long high mountains, the forbidden zone, became a symbol, not of defeat, but of the limits of American doctrine and the existence of alternative ways of fighting wars. Today, special operations forces around the world study Australian SAS methods from Vietnam. Long-range patrol doctrine, tracker integration, psychological operations. What was once too controversial to acknowledge has become curriculum at Fort Bragg and Coronado. But something was lost in translation. Modern forces can replicate the tactics. They struggle to replicate the psychology, the willingness to become something other than a conventional soldier. The acceptance that effective hunting requires transformation, not just training.
Private Dorian Walker returned to Australia in 1970. He never served again. He lived among his people in the Western Desert. When researchers later attempted to interview him, he refused. "That knowledge belongs to the jungle," he told one historian. "It stays there." Captain William Dundas remained in the Australian Army until 1982. His classified lectures on jungle warfare remain required reading. Much of his contribution remains partially classified. Captain James Morrison completed his tour, returned to the United States, and never spoke publicly about what he witnessed. But his reports survived, locked in archives. A record of methods American doctrine was not prepared to adopt, and Australian authorities were not prepared to fully acknowledge. The long high mountains still exist. The jungle has grown back. The caves remain. Tourists pass nearby, unaware of what happened there. But for those who know the story, the mountains represent something else. A place where firepower failed, where technology failed, where an enemy was defeated not by bombs, but by fear, and where a small group of men became something their allies could not fully understand. Not soldiers, not commandos, but hunters, the Hmong, the jungle ghosts.